Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Edward Whelan, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I have 2 of 3 of the books that you helped edit. Right here is the most recent, if I'm not mistaken, the Essential Scalia. And then I have this one, Scalia Speaks. Before we get started and we start talking about, Justice Scalia and why you wrote these books, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I suppose most relevant to these books is that I am a former law clerk to Justice Scalia. I clerked for him 30 years ago now. It's hard to believe. And it was one of the great honors of my life. I have worked in and out of government, including in the Department of Justice in the George W. Bush administration, and as for the Senate Judiciary Committee during the Clinton presidency. And for 17 years, I headed the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where I'm still affiliated. I stepped down from the presidency there in February, and I'm now in my capacity as a distinguished senior fellow and Antonin Scalia Chair in Constitutional Studies.
Wonderful. So again, before we get into the books, what first appealed to you about the law, and why did you decide to go into the legal profession?
Boy, that's a good question. I sometimes wonder, whether I should have pursued some other career, but I think my mind is always inclined to making distinctions and trying to reason things out. Perhaps family members would say always argue, but I think I had a natural bent for it, a fondness for studying text and working my way through it. And I suppose I always found it, relatively easy, I suppose, compared, say, to things like music or design or a host of other things that I'm not very good at.
I have personal aspirations of being a lawyer, and every time I've spoken to a lawyer, they always tell me the same thing: don't be a lawyer, don't go into this profession. And I guess part of me is a little cynical in thinking that they don't want extra competition, but the other side, did you ever consider leaving the law, or did you stick it out?
Well, in a sense, I did leave the law, 17 years ago when I moved into the think tank world. I'm not a practicing lawyer. I instead am, writing about the law, drawing on my legal background and on legal skills, but I'm not working as a lawyer. But no, I at one point, even in law school, went through the whole foreign service process and thought seriously about that. So look, I think one reason people, I think, recommend to you and others not to become a lawyer is too many people do it as a default for want of imagination. And I may have been guilty of that as well. And I think it's something that it's better to try something else first, and then if you remain very interested in going to law school, I think you'll be more confident about it when you've tried something else. My impression back when I was in law school is that the unhappiest law students were those who had gone straight through from college without doing anything else. And I think that speaks to the value of whether it's pursuing a career or studying, doing something after college.
Mm-hmm. And you just spoke about the fact that you were thinking about the foreign service route. Why didn't you end up going down that route?
Gosh, lots of different reasons. I was, I had already gone through law school was in law school when I explored that. It was something of a lark, though I'd always been interested in international affairs. I think in the end, I realized that the foreign service would have been a great thing to do in the 1950s, but that technology, advanced communications, other things made it a much less interesting job in what would have been the 1980s or 90s.
Well, these books that I mentioned earlier were fantastic. I really enjoyed them. You guys did a really good job in compiling the speeches in one book, and then targeting the newest book to aspiring lawyers or people that are lawyers already. You mentioned earlier that you got to clerk for Justice Scalia 30 years ago now. What was that experience like?
Well, I and my law clerk, my co-clerks rather, I think learned so much just by being in proximity to Justice Scalia, by having him challenge us, whether orally in questions when we would meet, or working on our drafts. And we really had the opportunity to try to learn to think like him. And we sometimes said we thought we had the hardest job on the among the clerks in one sense, in that for many clerks it was just a matter of figuring out which way their boss wanted to go and to write things up. For us, we knew we had to get it right, and that if we wrote something up that, even if it reached the result that Justice Scalia tentatively thought that he wanted, if it didn't write well, if it didn't cohere, if it didn't persuade, it'd be back to square one. And he would often reconsider his positions. He would say, sometimes in disappointment, it doesn't write, which was his way of saying, when we see it in written form, it just doesn't work, and that's tells you that you need to go back and revisit your intuitions about a case.
And what would you say are some of the most important lessons you learned from Justice Scalia?
Oh boy. I think one lesson, and this comes out in one of the speeches in Scalia Speaks, is that good writing requires hard work. Many people admire Justice Scalia's writing, as they should, but they think that perhaps writing came easily to him. He liked to say, I think he's quoting, I don't know, Dorothy Parker, that he did not enjoy writing, he enjoyed having written. And for him, writing is something that consumed his entire attention. Every word matters. A good writer has to be able to stand outside himself and see how other people would read what he's written. It's not enough that you know what you mean to say. It has to be clear to others reading it. And you need to be able to challenge your own ideas and make sure that what you're writing is sound. So again, that's a discipline that requires hard work. Certainly when it comes to judging, a lesson that I learned from Justice Scalia is you need to discern the proper principles and apply them neutrally and impartially, whether or not that gets you, the policy results you would want. I think that's a very important lesson about the role of the judiciary, in the American system.
Mm-hmm. Before we go into what Justice Scalia would, the topic of originalism and textualism and all that, I wanted to ask, maybe this is a question that's going to shoot me in the foot, and it's just personal curiosity. Do you think that the legal profession is an elitist profession in some ways? Because a lot of to clerk for some of the justices, you need to have attended Harvard Law School or Yale or whatnot. What would you say is the reason for that, and do you think it's justified?
Well, the word elitism can cover a lot of things. Some bad, some I would say good. Insofar as elitism involves sorting out on the basis of merit those who have demonstrated their talent, from those who haven't, it's good. But as your, I think, question rightly raises, there are many judges and justices who understandably but imperfectly use a law school as a proxy for the student's ability. And certainly students at Harvard and Yale benefit a lot from that. Now, pardon me for saying that you overstate things a little bit. I mean, certainly there are law clerks from students from other places who get excellent law clerks, including at the Supreme Court. But numerically, there's no doubt that law students at Yale and Harvard have had an advantage. And I think there's a certain clubbiness that can explain that. It's also just a matter of, I think from the justice's perspective, they're going to be playing it safe. They have very little information on which to base a judgment. And I think they're inclined to think that if you did well enough to get into a very good school and got good grades there, chances are you're going to be a pretty good clerk. Might they miss out on equally talented or more talented candidates as a result? Sure. But that's the there are always trade-offs in how you go about making personnel decisions.
Yeah, this topic piqued my interest once. I was listening to a Malcolm Gladwell podcast, and he was talking about Justice Scalia, and he had a clip of Scalia, I forgot, speaking at the American University, I believe, and this woman stands up and asks him, would it be possible that I could become one of your clerks? And he all but says no, because he says, I can't afford to be wrong. So I get people from Harvard and some of the the best schools. But I'm sorry if you want to say something, but just the interesting thing about that is he then goes on to say that one of his favorite clerks is Judge Jeffrey Sutton, who attended Ohio University. Ohio State Law School, right?
Law school, yeah.
And how do you add those up?
Well, Judge Sutton, as you know, was my co-editor on the Essential Scalia. Is a good friend of mine. We clerked together. It's one way to reconcile this is that Judge Sutton actually was a law clerk for retired Justice Powell, and law clerks for retired justices can sort of shop around and offer their extra time for sitting justices. So the fact of the matter is, Justice Scalia did not hire Jeff Sutton through the regular processes, but as he observed, was delighted by Jeff's excellent work, and Jeff is a great judge. But I think his principle of just playing it safe is one that is understandable, if regrettable in some of its effects.
Sometimes when we approach public figures, whether it be celebrities or judges, we always focus on their work, and again, rightfully so, but we kind of forget sometimes that there's a person behind the public figure. So I want to start talking about Scalia by asking, what was he like as a person?
Well, he was a remarkably gregarious, engaging person. I think he enjoyed meeting people, and really would enjoy good conversation with just about anyone. He had what I guess in olden days you could say was a bit of a Latin temperament. Maybe one's not permitted. Maybe that's an unacceptable stereotype these days. If so, I apologize. But what the phrase used to at least connote is someone who could have something of a temper, but then would blow past it, and might be singing in the hallways not long thereafter. I think that captures some of him. He loved. He had passions for, opera, squash, good books, and conversation, good eating, good wine. He really loved life, loved his family. He had a wonderful marriage and 9 kids, and at the time of his death, I believe the grandkids numbered in the mid-30s, and the number's gone up since then.
That's incredible. Um, I think like a lot of people that are my age, if you came around to Scalia's work, you saw his speeches somewhere on YouTube, and you were enthralled for an hour and a half by something he was saying and the way he spoke, because he was a wonderful speaker. What separates, I think, him and a lot of judges is the fact that you we do have a lot of his speeches as public domain, and it's available, obviously, in the written form and in the video form. Why do you think it was so important to him to visit college campuses, different organizations, and make so many media appearances?
Well, 2 answers to that. One, he loved ideas, and he was an evangelist for ideas, and he knew that colleges and law schools were places where his ideas weren't often heard, and he figured that if he had the chance to get people to hear him, he would convert some folks. The second reason, which may have played more heavily in later years, is he loved to hunt and fish, and so if you could get an invitation to a place near good hunting or good fishing, and add that on attractive to him.
Mm. One of the things that Justice Scalia often fought was how law was taught at major law schools around the country. And he thought that there was, originalism wasn't taught, textualism wasn't taught, and he fought against that pretty much his whole career. Since he started fighting that battle, and then since his passing, do you think it's gotten better? Can you get that kind of education when you go to law school?
Well, my impression is that things have gotten somewhat better. He used to observe that the traditional law school curriculum, especially the first year, which would involve courses and things like torts and property and contracts, just imbued the notion of the common law judge, someone who's developing principles out of the ether rather than reading statutes or constitutional texts and trying to figure out what it means. And that this whole approach predisposed law students against textualism, and also made them think of the great judge as the person who could just make up these grand principles. My impression is that there are a lot more courses in, say, statutory methodology than there were when I was in law school. I think textual analysis is taken far more seriously. That said, when it comes to constitutional law, I think the law schools are, perhaps bend even further to the left than they did 30 years ago. There are a handful of originalists, but not many, and it's going to be difficult for, say, a conservative originalist with the most, distinguished resume to get a job at a top law school, whereas someone with living constitutionalist view will, be readily accepted. So I think he would still have lots of reasons to be disappointed, and in some ways more disappointed with the state of law schools, though there are some improvements in some places.
Yeah, to follow up on that, he used to go around, and there are multiple speeches people can look up on YouTube with him debating or talking to Justice Breyer, and they clearly disagreed about. I think they agreed pretty much on 90% of the things. It was the 10% that they always talked about, but maybe I'm wrong. but that's the feeling I got. But Justice Breyer once, I think I heard him say that the what makes the best judges is not having an adherence, is not adhering to a strict ideology or a strict interpretation of the law. Uh, I have a feeling that you disagree, but does he have a point?
Well, some of this may come down to terms, but no, I don't think he does. I mean, I think there's a French term, bricolage, for someone who can just, take different things and put them together in whatever fashion he wants to reach a certain result. And that, I think, captures Justice Breyer. If you don't have a principles and a methodology, and instead you just have all these tools you can use, here's a hammer, here's a set of pliers. When do you use them? Well, maybe you have good judgment in how maybe your intuitive sense tells you how, but you need to be able to over time to spell that out and explain it. Otherwise, there's a temptation to just use the tools that will get you the result you want. So I actually think Justice Breyer and Justice Scalia disagreed a lot more than 10%. I mean, Justice Breyer, whose intellect I admire greatly, on statutory interpretation, embraces pragmatism or purposivism, which are unconstrained and really give the judge leeway to reach pretty much whatever result he wants. And it's interesting that a lower court judge, Richard Posner, who also described himself as a pragmatist, was very dismissive of Justice Breyer's approach. So you can't even, different pragmatists are going to have different views on what's pragmatic. Now, Posner also was very hostile to Justice Scalia, so I don't mean to invoke him as any font of wisdom. But no, I think there's an obligation on the part of judges to do their best to develop a methodology, and to simply say, that I'll just use whatever tools make sense to me in any particular case. I don't think that is legitimate.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is that, if I'm not mistaken, it doesn't say in the Constitution that you have to interpret the Constitution in one way or the other, right? So I don't think it ever preached originalism, nor does it, say that we have to make it up as we go along. Why is originalism better than anything else?
Well, you're of course right that the Constitution doesn't have a provision that says read these words to mean what they say. And even if it did, someone would say, well, how should we know that we should read that provision to mean what it says? I think the very fact that it was written, as Hamilton explains in Federalist 78, is for the purpose of laying down markers, and it presupposes that this will be understood to be law, and that folks will apply the classic principles to determining what the law means. Now, within originalism, there are different sub schools, and you can fight things out among those schools. But the basic notion that written law ought to be interpreted in accordance with with its original sense, dates well back beyond the Constitution to Blackstone, and that was the world in which the framers wrote. And it would make no sense. I mean, the whole purpose of a Constitution is to put in place boundaries, and the idea that those boundaries somehow could be construed to mean whatever people think later on, strikes me as absurd. I mean, even some people say, oh well, there are some rules in the Constitution, and those will construe according to what they mean, but these other things are all just loose standards. Well, look, even the provision that says that a person has to be 35 in order to be eligible to become president, what does 35 mean? It doesn't say in base 10. It could be in base 6 or base 12. So yeah, the Constitution doesn't provide specific rules for how it should be interpreted, but it was adopted in the context where the rules were widely understood.
Yeah, I agree. Because because of my admiration for Justice Scalia, I um, I could talk about probably for hours about all the things I admire, but I will push back maybe a little bit just to ask questions about some of the things that maybe I never got clarification on. One of the things, and anytime I saw an interview with Justice Scalia, when he talked about Bush v. Gore, I never really he would always say the following thing. He goes, "Oh, that thing, just get over it." And it's hard to get over that thing. It's a big, what's that? So
Well,
why
look,
did
I think the one time he said get over it was some 7 or 8 years after the ruling was issued, and he was so I don't know that he always said that, but look, he set forth by his vote, and I'm trying to recall whether I can't even recall now whether he wrote a separate opinion in that case. His views of the case, the opinions speak for themselves. Obviously, it was a case that was decided on an incredibly tight time frame. There's ample reason to believe that he would have preferred that the case be decided on the basis of the concurring opinion that he wrote or joined. Part of my poor memory, I should know this, rather than the majority opinion. It's not a justice's job to explain outside of his role in a particular case what a ruling means. And did he get impatient at some point with being peppered about that? I suppose he did, but it seems to me it's a sufficient answer to say, look, in this case and in others, judge me by what I wrote or the vote I cast, and if you want to fault me in some cases, credit me in others.
One of the things I've never gotten clarification on is not the decision as much as it is about why they took on the case. Scalia spent most of his life talking about the fact that, if you want something done, pass a law, right? He always told Congress to do their job. If you want abortion bill, pass a law. So why not, when deciding the president of the United States, or why would they push it to the Supreme? Why would the Supreme Court decide to take on the case instead of telling Congress to do its job?
Well, you're taking me into minutiae of the case that are out of my memory at this point, but have in mind that the court was reviewing a decision by the Florida Supreme Court, so which seemed very disruptive of ordinary procedures. Now, it may well be that Congress, pursuant to the constitutional provisions, could well have decided things notwithstanding. But I think that the Florida litigation, got things going. Litigation brought by Al Gore's campaign and decided in a very unsatisfactory way by the Florida Supreme Court. So that's again, I need to get into more. I'm not ready to get into deeper minutiae at this point on this.
Mm-hmm. So maybe to pivot away to something more positive, one of the qualities that people most admire in Justice Scalia is his ability to be friends with people on the opposite side of the aisle, people that disagree with him politically. And I think we live in a world now where that's increasingly taboo and increasingly difficult. one of obviously the famous friendship he had with Justice Ginsburg. They disagreed, but they went to, they rode camels in Egypt, and then they went to see the opera all the time. And it's one of
They and their
those.
spouses, pardon me for interrupting, but they and their spouses celebrated New Year's Eve together every year for years on end. They had a real fondness for each other that I think does speak to something very special and says something good about both of them. Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Maybe to just finish the question. Do you think we've lost our ability to be friends with people that we disagree with politically?
Boy, it sure seems like it. I mean, I think that we have, as a nation, gotten very, very polarized. There are topics that simply can't even be discussed without people getting angry at each other. It's very difficult to explore ideas on things that without triggering people. So I think it's a very damaging environment, and certainly nothing like the rough and tumble in which both Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg grew up. And also, you mentioned their friendship, and Justice Scalia was also very fond of Justice Elena Kagan, who incidentally, as you know, wrote the foreword to the Essential Scalia, and Justice Ginsburg wrote the foreword to Scalia Speaks. And I think, in terms of, so look, I think Justice Scalia loved argument and debate, not for the purpose of scoring points, but in the belief that if you engage in good faith discussion with someone, you'll come to understand that person better. You'll actually learn something. You might reconsider your own ideas. You might recommit to your ideas, but have a better understanding why they're right. That basically good faith discussion fosters friendship and tends toward truth, helps bring both people, sides of the discussion towards not to truth, but towards truth. And so he loved discussion and debate for that reason, and he especially loved talking with people who disagreed with him. How boring it would be to be surrounded by people who just agree with you all the time, or who don't have the guts to speak out and explain why they disagree. And that has to be one of the saddest things about the modern speech environment. People just can't talk, and they can't talk freely. They can't explore ideas without worrying that someone's going to take a Twitter clip and shame them into being canceled. So it's a very different environment now. So I think it's a very harmful one. I think it's one that Justice Scalia, Justice Ginsburg, and I think Justice Kagan would all decry.
Yeah, and this extends even further, in my opinion. I think if you watch old confirmation hearings, like the one that Justice Scalia had, they were more. Yeah, I think what we spoke about earlier extends to confirmation hearings for judges today. If you watch old confirmation hearings, especially the one of Justice Scalia, people are laughing. They're asking actual substantive questions, but most likely they'll vote to confirm the justice, no matter where they fall on their interpretation of the Constitution. How did hearings get so political today, and in general, how do we get out of this mode, I guess?
Well, that's a big question. I think you're actually being too favorable to senators at Justice Scalia's hearing. The fact of the matter is that Justice Scalia was nominated to fill Associate Justice Rehnquist's seat when Rehnquist was nominated to become Chief Justice. And the Democrats decided that their best bet was to go after Rehnquist, in which case, if they blocked him from getting elevated, there would be no vacancy in which to put Scalia. Also, you had at the time a significant Republican majority in the Senate, and you had the first Italian American justice ever at a time when I think ethnic politics were stronger than, at least when it comes to the Italian American issue, than they are now. It was only a year later that you had the Bork debacle. And I think the most significant thing that changed in that 1 year period is that Democrats won control of the Senate in the 1986 election. So the deference, a lot of the deference to Justice Scalia was tactical, very politically motivated. I don't think it reflected a different time. And indeed, if you look at the Rehnquist hearing at the same time, which got very nasty, I think you'd see that. But look, what's happened over the last several decades is the parties have sorted themselves out and defined themselves ever more on grounds of judicial philosophy, and indeed on grounds of political ideology generally. In the mid-1980s, you had some very liberal Republicans and some very conservative Democrats. There aren't many, if any, in either category anymore. So that means that things are much more polarized. And indeed, what you see in every nomination since Justice Ginsburg's in 1993, I'm sorry, I should say in every Supreme Court confirmation hearing since Ginsburg's in 1993, you've had a president of one party making a nomination to a Senate controlled by the same party. And that has actually helped to keep the heat down, because the understanding is you hold on to your majority and the person will get confirmed. What happened in 2016 after Justice Scalia's death, when President Obama went to fill a vacancy, is you had the scenario that hadn't existed in a long time. We had a president of one party making a nomination to a Senate controlled by the opposite party, and an election year no less. And this was exactly the configuration that Joe Biden had recognized way back in 1992 would lead to obstruction. Biden himself had warned the first President Bush not even to make a nomination before the election, and it made clear that Biden would not move on any nomination. So I don't think. Yes, there's been some change. It's mostly been the parties sorting themselves politically, but we've actually been fortunate, if you want to view it that way, that all of the vacancies, or all the vacancies since then, with the exception of the Scalia vacancy, have arisen at a time when you had the president and the Senate under control of the same party.
Yes, but if you look at all these confirmation hearings, I mean, during the Trump administration, for example, you had Gorsuch to replace Scalia, and then you had Kavanaugh, and at the end, Amy Coney Barrett. These confirmation hearings were forest fires. That's what they were. I mean, it looked from the outside like it looked terrible for the United States. I mean, I understand it needing to, in some ways it has to be a show of one kind or another, but it was really bad.
I agree, and I think you're right. Say, to draw a stark contrast between that and, say, the Ginsburg and Breyer hearings in 1993 and 1994, which I worked on and attended. where the Republicans were very, very civil and ended up overwhelmingly supporting both nominees. Justice Ginsburg was confirmed, I believe, 96-3, and Breyer 87-9. So I think a lot changed when Senate Democrats launched their unprecedented campaign of partisan filibusters against President Bush's lower court nominees in 2003, and then went after Roberts to some extent, but more especially Sam Alito in 2005 and 2006, including an effort to filibuster the Alito nomination. I think, but I think what's happening at the same time, though, is the parties are redefining themselves, sorting themselves on ideological grounds, so that a Republican senator who in 1993 could say, "Oh, I'm going to defer to the president, even though he's of an opposite party, and vote for this nominee," had a much greater difficulty saying that 16 years later. You look at Sonia Sotomayor versus Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I would have been amazed if you told me in 1993 that 30-something Senate Republicans would vote against the first Hispanic nominee to the Supreme Court. But they did so in part because the political pressure from the base intensified. Basically, Republicans, the conservative base, caught up to where the liberal base was on the Bork nomination way back in '87. So yes, things have intensified, but I think that's really a reflection of the increased polarization between the parties.
Yeah, maybe this is a very general question, but what do you see the future of the Supreme Court being going forward? And are you for any kind of term limits for justices, or any kind of changes to their tenure?
Well, to start with the last, look, in theory, if I were, czar of the universe, I could see some rules involving, term limits that might work, though we have to be very careful about unintended consequences. I don't see any plausible reform that could be done without a constitutional amendment, and I don't see how any constitutional amendment would ever be adopted. So, to my mind, these things are just off the table. Going forward, I think we're going to have some, we'll have some fights. I've believed all along that the only way these fights will end is if one side somehow wins decisively. That doesn't seem likely to happen. And I think what you're going to have is, it'll be interesting to see if we have a vacancy in what I'll call as a shorthand an opposite party situation. That is, where you have a Senate controlled by a party opposite the president's. If that happens, it's one thing for that to happen in an election year. If that happens earlier in a term, what happens? Will the parties, will there be a standstill for 3 years? Look, there's ample reason to think there might be. Will there be some sort of compromise reached? Well, that's a lot harder. That's a lot harder to do these days. But White Houses have their political imperatives too. No White House wants to be seen as a failure, not getting someone through. So maybe there would be, some effort to compromise. A lot, of course, depends on the political margin in the Senate. If you have a, 50, if you're facing a 55 vote majority against you, it's tougher than if you're facing a 51 vote, just in terms of how many you have to pick off. So yeah, I think we're going to have more fights.
Right. Maybe to go back to the book a little bit, to the books. Sorry. One of the things I see that I noticed while reading the books is how much Justice Scalia valued every word he wrote, and how he wanted everything to either be readable, accessible, and inspirational. Um, what would you say the importance of writing and words in general to him were?
Well, again, he cared very much about conveying his ideas clearly, and obviously, when you're writing, you have the opportunity to do so. When you're speaking, it's more challenging, but you can also do so there as well. One thing that's interesting about his writing is that, and I don't know whether he studied, rhetoric in high school. It wouldn't surprise me, but he cared very much how the written words sounded. When read aloud, it's an odd thing, but I think it's part of what made him such a great speech speech giver, a speech writer, writing speeches for himself. He developed this sense of whether it be the rhythm of language, the use of alliteration, the powerful figure of speech. He loved to hear how what he wrote sounded, and he would often read passages aloud. He might get on the phone and say, "Clarence, you got to hear this." Um, and when he was really happy with an opinion, he would say, "This sings." Um, an interesting verb to use that I think again shows that he understood things musically. He heard the words even as he wrote them. So that's a very, very interesting quality to his writing.
Yeah. Maybe on a little bit of a personal note, uh, what do you miss most about Justice Scalia?
Well, he was always very good to me, and I'm very grateful to him. He was just a fun person to chat with. I can see him at the clerks reunions with a glass of wine in his hand and a big smile on his face, just taking joy in the world of clerks with their ever growing world of former clerks succeeding in different capacities, having their own families. So I guess I miss his joy. He was effervescent, and just a pleasure to be around.
Yeah. And if he were alive today, and this is maybe a two-part question. One, let's separate this question for you and for Justice Scalia. If he were alive today, what advice would he give to aspiring lawyers? And the same question goes to you.
Well, one thing that he often tell his law clerks is, don't spend your time in DC or New York. Go back to your community. That's where you can have real impact. You can live. You can raise a family. You can get involved in your church or clubs, and I think he thought that too many people thought it was important to be where the power is. I'm trying to recall, the Scalia Speaks book has a commencement address that he gave at a law school in the 1980s while he was still a circuit court judge. So there'll be some more specific wisdom there. But, I think he would say, look, you have one life to live. Don't chase someone else's dream. I think my own advice would be somewhat similar. I warn attorneys and aspiring attorneys against what I call the tyranny of the billable hour. The notion that, oh gosh, it's Thursday afternoon and Billy's soccer game starts in 45 minutes, but do I really want to fight traffic and go out to his game? He's not going to notice if I'm not there anyway. And gosh, these 2 or 3 hours would be X hours of billable time, and well, gosh, maybe I can pretend to watch while I'm on the conference call on the sidelines. Just this, just this way of thinking about things, monetizing your time, which in a sense is inevitable, but is also, I think, very, very sad. I would certainly say beware the tyranny of the billable hour, and do what you can to build your life so that it's one that brings you satisfaction and doesn't just have you a highly paid servant.
That's really good advice. And I think a lot of people, when they go to law school, especially if they take on a lot of debt, they always think about, they have to pay it off somehow. And they take these kind of jobs because, well, $200,000 out of law school is hard to say no to. And you kind of have to say yes to that because, we got, again, bills to pay and all that. But
on that, if I could just interrupt, there may well be some truth to that, and certainly law school tuitions have soared since I was in law school, and I just have real sympathy for the condition that lots of folks are in. That said, there are lots of people whose spending manages to match whatever income they're making, and so if you're in a situation where you feel the need to pay off debt, get serious about it. Maybe you will have a roommate or two in a less desirable part of town rather than your own 2-bedroom apartment in a nicer part of town. Maybe you'll have to make some meals for yourself rather than eating out all the time. Maybe you have to watch your other expenses. Again, if you're saying you're going into a private sector job in order to pay off debt, make sure you're paying it off.
Yeah. What other career routes can people consider if they're considering law school?
Well, look, lots of people become lawyers just because lawyers can move into lots of other areas, and law school is so expensive these days that I think it's worth having in mind the opportunity cost of going to law school and thinking what you could do, not just with the money you end up spending, but with those 3 years of time. So I'm not going to recommend grad school as an alternative unless someone really has a passion for it. I think getting out, finding a job that challenges you. Maybe in DC here, it's working on Capitol Hill. I think that's something that could be very interesting for people for a couple of years. Maybe it's who knows? People are going to have different interests. I think teaching it would be very, very rewarding for a lot of people. It's striking how many lawyers, if they're asked the question, if money weren't an issue, as if you're going to be paid the same amount no matter what job you took, what would you want to do? The answer I heard a lot from my former colleagues was teach high school. Well, why not try teaching high school before you incur all this debt and then believe that your options are foreclosed.
Also, I mean, you can also encourage them to get a law degree and become a high school teacher, because that's an overly qualified high school teacher. So I think, yeah. But your advice is better than mine. I finish up all my podcasts by asking my guests 2 questions, and I'm going to give them up front, and you can answer them in whatever order you please. The first one is, if you have any, what gives you hope for the future? It could be as general or as specific as you'd like.
Repeat that, please. I'm sorry.
Oh, what gives you hope for the future? And the second question is, what are 5 books on any topic, nonfiction or fiction, that you would recommend to people?
Wow. Okay.
That second one always gets people. So
yeah. Well, five's gonna be tough to come up with here. No, I can give you 3 right away.
Sure.
I'll give you 4. You can read Scalia Speaks, Scalia's on the second book of the series on faith, and then the Essential Scalia on the Constitution, the courts, and the rule of law, which while it'll be appreciated most by lawyers and law students, I think is also accessible to the general populace as well. More seriously, I love the writings of G.K. Chesterton. I think his very short book Orthodoxy is a very powerful and bracing tonic to the postmodern age, that existed back in Britain when he was writing a century ago. In terms of what gives hope for the future, I'm not a great optimist for the things of this world, and when you look at what's going on around us, it's not easy to be hopeful about how things will be in 5 or 10 or 20 years. That said, it gives me hope. I meet a lot of wonderful young people, and who are talented, full of energy. A lot of the people I meet are, deeply devoted to their faith. I'm talking about people now of different religious faiths, but who are working hard to discern the vocation that they believe God is calling them to. And I think they're going to be powerful beacons in this world, even if they're greatly outnumbered by the standard woke 20 and 30 something.
Well, with that, I wanted to thank you for coming onto my podcast and taking the time to speak with me. It was a real privilege. I apologize for the interruptions a few times, but overall, it was a very enlightening conversation. I want to put these two up, so people should go out and get them. They're incredibly accessible, and I highly recommend them. The one I don't have is called On Faith, so you should get that too. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All the best to you.
Thank you. You too.